Hello and welcome to the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the plastic waste problem in Northern Ireland and what we can do to move this issue forward. And to go through this really important topic, we have Tim Walker, who is Senior Vice President of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management. Tim, you're very welcome to the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast.
Hi. I'm looking forward to speaking to you this afternoon.
Tim, my first question to you is the plastic problem in our waste. Obviously, it's everywhere, but can you outline for us just what the nature of this is in Northern Ireland?
Well, the issue is that we're obviously consuming considerable amounts of material. One of those is plastic. And as recognition of environmental issues goes up people's register, they become aware of just how much plastic they're throwing in the bin. Now, plastic is one of those miracle products in that it was, developed and widely distributed throughout the 20th century. And there was no real thought ultimately to what happens to this stuff. It was lightweight, it was cheap, it was easily produced, it was flexible, and it served a multitude of different ways of getting food and other materials from the retailer to us, the consumer. And when it was on an occasional basis, when there was lower levels of this material, we simply disposed of it into our residual waste or our black bins. Obviously, as we've gone on, and the amounts of plastic use have gone up. And as we've recycled more, we as a society become more and more aware of just how much plastic is being disposed of into that black bin. And because of because some of the issues about managing it, it's become really apparent in the world, in the natural environment. We've seen it in the hedgerows, we've seen it on the beaches, we've seen it in the sea. And this stuff, because of the very things that made it so popular, its flexibility, its resistance, its durability, are the very things that are now coming back to haunt us in that it's long lasting.
Yeah, and also, I think you've highlighted it very well there. It's almost the misuse of plastic is the problem, really. It's not the bespoke use of it, it's the misuse of it and how we're not actually properly, using it for the right purposes, and also not really making sure that when we do use it, that we reuse it in essence.
Yeah, the ones we've really focused on are the rigid plastics. So the plastic bottles from your kitchen and from your bathroom are the obvious ones, which are easy to recycle. But, plastic has got so many other uses, and we see it in plastic film and flexible plastics, which tend to not have been collected by councils, and certainly not councils in Northern Ireland. And that has led to this legacy of plastic film in our black bins. But, you do have the issue where some people can't recycle. And so while the focus may well be on plastic film, there are other plastics that escape. And there are events in life, which means that, plastic is not the key issue for you, or even, heaven forbid, waste isn't the key issue for you, and we see that in the bins going forward. We see that in the litter bins on the street going forward, and that there's quite a degree of litter associated with certain choices in life. And certainly some of those plastics feature quite heavily, as Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful will know from its litter surveys and litter characterization studies, just what is out there in the public realm as much as anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's a whole bank of research being done on the nature of the litter problem. Now, Tim, you mentioned there, we've talked about recycling, and it's interesting because over the past number of years, obviously recycling about 25 years ago was seen as the predominant way to help the environment. But that debate seems to have moved a little bit to show that basically there are some limits to recycling. Whilst recycling is important and we want people to continue recycling and we want to continue to see recycling rates rise, there are some limits in recycling, aren't there, when we're talking about this specific problem?
You're so right, David. And we're beginning to stray into new ground in that the more things we look at, the more things we find are more complex than we thought they were. So when I started this voyage, it was simply a matter of seeking to get as much recycling going as possible. But as we have accelerated and increased our recycling, the scope of our recycling, in some regards, that preserves the existing consumption patterns. And what I mean by that is, because you recycle, you still don't limit how much stuff you buy. And really what we need to be doing is saying, ultimately, each and every one of us in Northern Ireland is generating something in the order of 16.6 tons per person per year in terms of the production of stuff that we then buy. And then ultimately, individually, we throw away into our bins just over half a ton per person per year. The plastic is obviously a lightweight fraction of that, but nevertheless, it's quite a sizable portion, given that it's so volumetric, it's so voluminous, but lightweight. And yeah, the recycling is, we've done much of the easy recycling, we've done much of the simple recycling, which is in this case around plastics, the plastic bottles from the kitchen and bathroom. What other plastics can there be, and how can we capture them? And are they the right grades of plastic? Because you get this strange issue where there's something in the order of 300 different grades of plastic, yet we just see them as simply plastic. And if we bundle all those together, you do get cross-contamination even within the plastic waste stream. Much of it can be sorted and separated in big sheds across the countryside. But nevertheless, all this requires energy. All this requires manipulation and handling. All this requires being brought around the countryside to various places or shipped overseas for treatment. And ultimately, in a carbon-constrained world, we have to be taking stock and say, is this where we want to go? We're in this moment of transition where we're going from a very wasteful society, where we're used to just consuming and producing, and the waste we generate is kind of an outworking of how we choose to live. And in the next couple of decades, if not sooner, we're going to be going into a waste-less or a much less waste-less society, where we need to be minimizing how much waste we produce. And there has to be a far clearer focus on reuse and minimization of materials right from the outset. Yeah, the issue for us, if we don't do that, we're going to be in a very difficult place. And plastic has obviously got a key role to play in terms of that productivity, but plastic by itself in its current form is largely an outworking of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. And Tim, that leads us very nicely on to my next question. It's about the policy challenges facing Northern Ireland on this and what we need to do. Now, obviously, with the executive down at the minute, there is no assembly, but we would anticipate it potentially coming back. What do we need to do, like at a local level, so devolved level, but also local government has an important role to play on this as well. Our local councils that are who do the bulk of the waste management in Northern Ireland. What do we need to do in terms of policy in order to get the trends moving in the right direction?
Well, there's been a massive acceleration of what's called the circular economy in the last, well, slightly more than a decade now, and this is moving away from this idea of hump and dump, take, make, and waste kind of proposal, whereby you buy stuff, you consume stuff, and you throw it away. And the focus now is saying, how do we close those loops? How do we bring stuff back into its reuse in the form it was generated for? And I suppose the issue at policy level is Northern Ireland's quite a neat little discrete area geographically, so it could be an ideal sandbox space to try some of this. Moving beyond simply being a sandbox space, the issue for us in the waste industry is we tend to be labeled as being in some ways responsible for managing all this waste, and by dint that we're managing this waste, we're responsible for the production of this waste, which is kind of a mishit, because we're merely picking up what society chooses to produce. So at a policy level, we the waste sector would like to see government being braver. You know, we the environmental movement and the wasters in that movement are very aware of the challenges facing the globe in terms of climate change, in terms of net zero, in terms of resource use, in terms of biodiversity loss, and a multitude of other issues. And the issue we are trying to get across increasingly stridently through our various trade associations and professional bodies is that government needs to take bigger steps faster. It needs to be braver. I mentioned about the sandbox space here. Northern Ireland was one of the first regions to introduce the plastic bag levy in the UK. Could we not introduce a plastic levy rather than a plastic bag levy? Last year in the UK, they introduced a plastic packaging tax at £300 per tonne of plastic consumed if it didn't have more than a 35% recycled content. Could that be extended to a greater level? Now, it won't work for some of the food grades, but nevertheless, there needs to be this focus on creating closed loops. So there's a pull in the marketplace to get those materials back into consumption and production for manufacturing and other purposes, so they don't litter the streets and they don't end up in the black bin. Northern Ireland is ideal in terms of creating those sort of policy initiatives. Mm-hmm. Could Northern Ireland also see about actually limiting the number of plastics on the marketplace? At this current moment in time, that is likely to fall foul of the Internal Markets Bill, which was produced by Westminster and which the Scottish government has fallen foul on with this deposit return scheme to include glass. We're not covering that today, so I'm going to stop that there. But yeah, could we not see about reducing the level, the number of plastic types being distributed and dispersed on the Irish market, Northern Irish market, so that we can make it easier to recover? Ultimately, in the waste sector, we see ourselves pretty much with the tap full on. So everything is just flowing into our society. It's being consumed by all the consumers. But then somehow we in the back end are supposed to divvy up and distribute all this stuff, meeting ever increasing recycling targets. Whereas to my mind, ultimately what waste policy must focus on is waste prevention, not producing waste in the first place, rather than scurrying around after the fact and trying to pick up and distribute and differentiate different wastes that are produced. I use the example of the waste with the tap being full on. Rather than keeping on trying to bail out the bath with the tap full on, could we not just turn the tap off a bit or turn the tap off?
Yeah. I mean, that's it, and that is something that we're increasingly finding the debate going toward. In terms of local government, so I'm talking about local councils. What do they need to be thinking about in terms of, because obviously it's, a lot of people don't put two and two together here. They don't seem to connect their rates bill to waste and to the growing waste problem, and that puts financial pressure on their local government. So basically, what do local councils need to be thinking about in this space?
Well, there's a variety of steps local councils could take, and it's tricky for them because from a council perspective, it's the one service, the one universal service everyone every household in a council area gets is the waste collection service. Obviously, the councils are stressing quite significantly and quite rightly so to minimise the amount of waste produced and to recycle as much as possible through the blue bins, the boxes. In some council areas, it's not actually a blue bin, but it's a green bin, and then the brown bin for the organics. But we're in a space where doing more of the same is just not going to reach those newer and higher targets. So what we're seeing in councils in England is they're moving to 3 weekly collections and 4 weekly collections. That creates a far greater pressure back bin because it forces people to recycle more because they have to use the capacity in their alternative bins. You also keep those alternative bins on either their regular cycle or you increase the collection cycle of those bins. That has to go with a huge education campaign, to promote and explain why you're doing this. And it can also be politically very unpalatable because this is tricky stuff. This is potentially unpopular stuff, but we can't just keep on doing more of the same. In terms of moving the circular economy dial, the councils could also look at creating zones or promotion packages around attracting in particular kinds of industry, around the reuse, around the remanufacturing, around the recycling scheme of things. They can articulate that. They can zone things in land use through the local development plans. They can set their policies to identify exactly what they're doing. And of course, they can lead by example. And there's many initiatives which councils are undertaking internally to minimize their use of single-use plastics, to make reusability the order of the day, to put in place things like water stations rather than have plastic bottles for the sale of water. And as you get into this, you begin to move just beyond the physicality of waste. You're into the whole issue of wastage. Be that a light switch, be that a tap that's left running, be that your procurement cycle. And some of the councils are using procurement as a mechanism or as a tool. by which they're looking at take-back schemes. It's been quite widespread over the years for things like computers, where you're effectively requiring the supplier of the computer to take it away at the end of its life for repurposing and recovery. And that could be extended to other materials as well. You can see it with oils, tires, and other materials. So it's beginning to look at these materials, and I'm moving away from the word waste, these materials as part of the product line and saying, how can we make sure that they do not get wasted? And local government can lead by example, and local government can lead by its policy, and local government can lead by its promotion of this. Now, unfortunately, with the likes of austerity, the promotion thing tends to have been dialed down a bit, because over the last, well, since 2007, 2008, some of that promotional issues have been less front and center. And that's where the likes of Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful has got a really key role to play in picking up that baton and providing a common message and a common brand across more than one council area, because the messages don't differ when you move from council area to council area. You know, the messages around this are regarding the littering messages, regarding the recycling messages, regarding the potentially the job opportunities around dealing with these materials. And obviously the bigger environmental message around this ultimately is not good for the environment to let these materials, going back to plastics, escape into the wild.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's such a good point. I mean, we talk about consistency of message. Obviously, there are limits, as you pointed out there, Tim, to what any local council can do about this. Obviously, there does need to be kind of a national framework there as well to work toward. I mean, you mentioned some of the issues some of the devolved governments have run into with the Internal Markets Bill, particularly in Scotland. Hard to believe that a deposit return scheme could be such a hot political issue, but yet it was earlier in the year in the recent SNP leadership contest. What do you think that the UK government needs to be doing in order to move this debate forward, and how to support the devolved administrations and therefore also local councils in actually doing the right things?
And that's a really big question. And what we're finding at the minute is with the UK government, with the British English government based in Westminster, is things like the extended producer responsibility, which was beginning to place responsibility for paying for the placing of certain materials on the market, what's euphemistically called POM, placing on the market. So that has kind of got a bit rocky. It's been in the pipeline, the policy pipeline, for about 2.5 years now. And it was one of a triumvirate of new policies. So there was extended producer responsibility, there was deposit return scheme you just mentioned, and there was also consistency of collection, something we have not yet touched upon, which is whereby councils limit the number of ways upon which they collect their waste to prevent or reduce any confusion householders may have and to make it easier to promote and brand. But many of these issues have proven tricky to get across the national policy line because of the sequencing of elections, for example. And again, that issue about how it may play to the gallery, how it may be perceived by consumers. So at the minute, the packaging scheme under extended producer responsibility is covered by the packaging recovery notes. Now, this is where it gets quite hazy, but the packaging recovery notes is if you're a producer of packaging, effectively you pay somebody to discharge your responsibility and to provide you with proof that your materials are being taken away for recycling. And at the minute, the packaging recovery note system in the UK is worth about 300 to 400 million a year. Extended producer responsibility, extended in the guise that's been proposed by government now over 2 years ago, effectively would remove that system and put in place an alternative where councils were paid directly for the recovery of those packaging, including plastics. And the sum placed against that was £1.7 billion per year. So some in the packaging chain have begun to push back on that, citing the cost of living crisis, saying that if these increased costs come to bear, they will have to pass those costs through to consumers. And therefore, it's an unjust time to be doing so due to the cost of living crisis, and that householders and consumers will not be able to afford this uplift on their basket of shopping. Well, at the minute, ratepayers are paying that through the household bill, and councils are struggling with what to do with these materials. whereas by introducing extended producer responsibility, it made those who are producing the materials, and plastic is right there in the middle of them, and by them having to pay for these materials, the focus is it would encourage them to simplify, streamline, use less complex packaging, less mixed plastics and next mixed materials to make them easier to recover and recycle. That now seems to be foundering, as I mentioned, because it was due to happen later this year and early next year, but that seems to be sequencing pretty well with a general election. And because certain associations have highlighted that that may not work well because of that cost of living issue, now may not be the time to introduce it because it may not play well in the ballot box.
Yeah, and you're right about how the sequencing of this can be so important, and for the myriad of factors you've outlined. The last question to you, Tim. Positives. I always like to end podcasts on a positive note. I always like to have our listeners go off with some positive thoughts. Where are we going in the right direction? I mean, because you talk there about job opportunities. You talk there about there actually are some exciting things coming out there with the emergence of a circular economy and kind of some of the new approaches that have been examined. There actually are some really exciting opportunities out there in terms of this debate. So what are the positives? What are you seeing from the great expertise that you have? What are you seeing that really makes you feel optimistic and excited about in terms of new opportunities on this?
Well, David, I feel you've almost done the job for me. Look, this is a really exciting time to be involved in the environmental sector because for decades we were viewed kind of as the Cassandra in the room. We were, condemned to tell the truth but always be ignored. It's now really coming to bear that much of what was highlighted, predicted, forecast 30, 40 years ago is actually true. So there's a really exciting time because stuff has to happen. Stuff has to change now. It's unfortunate, it's at the tip of a spear, but nevertheless, change is coming. And likewise, for those involved in the packaging chain and the plastic packaging chain, the level of expertise, the level of investment in R&D around things like bioplastics and alternative packaging mediums and packaging itself, how to make packaging better, how to minimize the carbon footprint of packaging. It's brilliant. I mean, it really is moving away from the old-fashioned, rather resource intense and resource hungry production capacity in the past into a much more dynamic, a much more respectful form of production. And certainly for those who are interested, there's a real chance to make a difference by getting involved in some of the more cutting edge packaging firms, by getting involved in the whole environmental movement. And the environmental movement now has got more relevance and greater prospects for being heard than it ever had before. So yeah, look, this is a great time, a salutary time, but a great time nonetheless to be in this space. And the way that you've got new fuel sources, the way you've got new clothing, the new reclothing or remanufacturing of clothing is really critical. And textiles is another big area given its carbon footprint, and manufacturing itself. I mean, I was reading just the other day about how the steel industry is going to have to decarbonize really quickly. I mean, that's a huge sector, generating a vast proportion of carbon through coking coal to smelt steel. How is all that going to happen? What's going to be the influence into the airline industry, into the maritime industry, into the car industry? And there's very interesting things about going back to that sequencing issue, about the sequencing of Britain and the Europe around the proportion of cars that are made up from foreign overseas parts, and how you avoid trade tariffs and barriers around that. So lawyers, marketing, psychologists, practitioners, industrialists, lobbyists, this is a really hot space to be in.
Yeah, wow. And again, it's so complex. And again, we've only scratched the surface in this podcast, but it's been so worthwhile having a conversation with you, Tim, about this. And look, thank you so much for giving us your thoughts. You've been listening to Tim Walker, who is the Senior Vice President of Chartered Institute of Waste Management. And my name has been David McCann, and you have been listening to the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful podcast. Please make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can be reminded of future episodes.